begin, we'd just like to remind you that the actor we're about to see is not for the faint of heart.
I just saw the future of rock and roll. Their name is Twisted Sister.
Good evening and welcome to our show. Tonight, the main course is the one and only Twisted Sister, a band that has copped a pretty bad rap as people will judge them for admittedly cheesy and cornball videos from the 80s, and they'll just write them off and the material is hokey, dated, and just not worth listening to. And even though there's a small percentage of the material that does fit that description, I won't lie, if you put away your preconceived notions about listening to a supposed hair metal band, you'll find a treasure trove of traditional metal that'll wreck your senses in the best possible way. While there's silly elements of this band to be found, especially in the theatrics they used, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit dated myself, but I love the somewhat vaudevillian antics of this band, and the theatrics in general. I was raised on bands like Kiss, Motley Crue, and Alice Cooper. A little bit of makeup and costumes goes a long way to make a band memorable, in my opinion. And they don't rely on the costumes and the gimmick. They actually have songs, and great ones at that. So here it is, my retrospective of the one and only Twisted Sister. Twisted Sister was formed before many people had ever actually heard of them. Way back in 1972, when John Segal, who would soon be rechristened as JJ French, joined a glitter rock band called Silver Star. They envisioned themselves as a New Jersey version of the New York Dolls with a lot of influence from bands like Slade, Bowie, and Lou Reed. JJ hated the name Silver Star and convinced him to change it, eventually landing on Twisted Sister, a suggestion from the band's original singer, Michael O'Neill. And the name fit because of the androgynous look of all the glam bands of the time. And the lineup of this time isn't very important, because everyone but JJ would be gone before the release of the first record. They got to work playing 6 nights a week at Jersey bars and clubs, and they were making decent money, but the lineup was pretty volatile. JJ was the only sober person in the band. He actually joined the band as a way to get away from drugs and alcohol, believe it or not, and everyone else wasn't quite as straight edge. All I'm saying is, at one point, there was an incident involving the original singer drunkenly pointing a gun, a loaded gun, I might add, at the drummer. It goes without saying that the band wasn't exactly built to last. But eventually, JJ picked up the pieces, and in 1975, got his high school friend, Eddie Fingers Ojeda, to join the band as a second guitar player. And in 1976, the man, the myth, the legend, Dee Snider, joined the band as a new vocalist, and he would soon become the primary songwriter, writing damn near the band's entire discography on his own, barring a couple tracks here and there. And as great as he is as a songwriter, he's even better as a frontman, instantly owning any stage he walks onto, holding the audience in the palm of his hand. And his voice ain't bad either. He's no Rob Halford, but he knows how to use it very well. In fact, the entire reason he joined the band initially was they needed a singer who could sing Led Zeppelin songs to make more money. In 1978, Mark the Animal Mendoza joined, replacing their previous bass player because he became a born-again Christian and deemed the band satanic, which is pretty funny since they're hardly Bathory, and Mark Mendoza was a big reason why the band went into a much harder direction than the glam rock that they had been playing prior, since he was such an aggressive bass player, and he changed the sound and the band in a really big way. As the band was honing its chops in the clubs, they became a huge draw in the Jersey and New York area, at one time even selling out the New York Palladium, a venue that can hold up to 3,000 people, which is really impressive, especially when you consider the fact that they couldn't get a recording contract to save their lives, and they hadn't had even the slightest whiff of radio play. And even though they're making good money playing the bars every night, they knew it couldn't last forever. The drinking age was going to increase from 18 to 21. It's not exactly the most stable job either of all time. Though in 1982, the band finally found some good luck. They found the last remaining piece of their classic lineup, drummer AJ Pero, and they got a recording contract from a British independent label called Secret Records, which I know is not ideal, but after 10 years of trying, they gotta take what they can get. And finally, after years of trying, Twisted Sister released their debut album, Under the Blade.
At the end of the show, I went backstage to see the band, and they were sitting around a table, and they'd got more money on this table than I'd ever seen in my life, in cash, piles of it, from the merchandising. And all their merchandising had arrived in a big lorry, and it was going out completely empty. I think there was a torn poster in the bottom. And I'm looking at this thinking, crap, I'm never going to be able to afford this band. And one of them turned around and said, hey man, you got to sign us, we're really cheap.
So he shows up, he loves the band, he says to the band he wants to sign us, we don't react at all.
I think Martin Hooker, his name was, he was like, I just said I want to sign the band. And Mark Boone was like, yeah, I know, it's just they kind of heard this a few times before.
Well, what you don't know sure can hurt you. Well, what you can't see makes you scream. Well, what you don't know sure can hurt you. What you don't have is what you dream.
After crafting their live show through years and years of shows in dingy clubs, Twisted Sister made an effort to keep a sense of their live grandiosity intact on their studio records, especially on Under the Blade. Though live Twisted Sister is a whole different animal compared to them on record, to be fair. And Under the Blade has pretty much everything great about them right off the bat, which is so rare for a debut album. But since they were together so long, they had a decent amount of time to refine their act. The only thing slightly lacking is the production. They were on an indie label whose first ever release was the Exploited's Punk's Not Dead. It's not exactly surprising that this album is rough around the edges. Also, it was recorded in a barn, and UFO's Pete Way produced it. I'm not kidding. The somewhat punky production works really well for the more aggressive numbers like Shoot 'Em Down and Tear It Loose, which the latter includes a guitar solo from Fast Eddie Clarke of Motorhead fame, but we'll talk more about Motorhead a bit later. And this song is only a few down-picked and palm-muted riffs away from being a thrash metal song.
Gonna tear it loose. Gonna shout it from the roof. Blast my way into the night. I'm gonna live my dream. Shout and scream. Gonna tear it loose. Tear it loose. Tear it loose. Tear it loose.
In fact, probably the number one complaints of this album I've seen is the production and how raw it sounds. And so people will let subpar sound ruin albums for them. May I remind them what genre they are listening to? If this was synth pop or R&B or something, I can maybe understand. But this is metal. No production on a metal record can really make it or break it. Besides that one. And besides, you can still tell what's happening. There's nothing lost in translation. The only big flaw I can make out is sometimes the guitar solos are a bit too quiet in the mix, but that's about it. And speaking of which, I am not a big fan of the 1985 remix. It's too clean, and it doesn't have the same bite of the original 1982 pressing. And also, I am not a big fan of I'll Never Grow Up. That song kinda sucks. Speaking of which, D, can we please get the 1982 version on Spotify? And when people usually discuss this album, they usually mention the faster songs like the title track and What You Don't Know Sure Can Hurt You. And I love those songs as well, but the album also has a side of slower and groovier songs, like the beginning of Run For Your Life and Day of the Rocker, which I really like because it's a side of this band you don't really see too often. But my favorite song is definitely one of the slower cuts, Destroyer. It's almost doom metal and very reminiscent of Judas Priest songs when they write, songs about characters or a monster of some sort. It's menacing and probably the best solo of J.J. French's career.
Clear the air with this fiery stare and almost there. Destroyer, destroyer, destroyer is in town.
Songs like Sin After Sin are so evil, I love it. And surprising when other tracks off this album had such a panic surrounding them, when songs like this are far more blasphemous if you ask me. I also love the little mini solos in between the repeats of the chorus, that's pretty unique. And speaking of songs with panic surrounding them, we have the title track. It's a disturbing song about the paranoias people have about getting surgery, like a nightmare version of going to the hospital. It's probably the closest thing to a hit this album has, since it's always been a live staple. And later on in the 80s, during the PMRC Senate hearing, which we'll discuss later, this song caught the ire of Miss Gore, since she thought it was about BDSM and kinky sex, to which Dee responded with one of the greatest burns of all time.
As the creator of Under the Blade, I can say categorically that the only sadomasochism, bondage, and rape in this song is in the mind of Ms. Gore.
Open your mouth, cry. You know you can't. It's over now. Blade is gonna ride. 'Cause you're under the blade. Oh, you're under the blade.
Under the Blade is a primal and searing record. It's not perfect, the production could be better, the Bad Boys of Rock and Roll is cheesy to the point of diabetes, and Dave the Rocker goes on a bit too long. But that's about it. If you ask me, this album is super underrated and really doesn't get enough love. Afterwards, this album did pretty well in the UK metal scene. Keep in mind this is at the heights of the new wave of British heavy metal movements, and they fit right in. But then, just as things were looking up for the band, Secret Records went belly up, and the band once again found themselves without a label. But on a hunch from their manager, I believe, they went back to Britain for a bit. They made a lot of favors for the cash to get over there, sold a bunch of stuff, so it was all or nothing. Either they could get a deal during this trip, or that was the end of the band and they would have to break up, since every American label passed on them like 5 times over. Luckily, with a little bit of buzz they got from Under the Blade, they managed to get on a show called The Tube, and they just annihilated the crowd. They enlisted the help of Lemmy and Robo from Motorhead, Dee took off his makeup to rile up the crowd even further, and they just killed it. And Phil Carson, the same guy who signed AC/DC, decided to take a chance on the band and sign them to Atlantic Records, the same label who blacklisted them in the club days. This caused a lot of friction in Atlantic's American division. In fact, Phil Carson had a conversation with Doug Morris, the CEO of Atlantic, who called to his sister basically everything about a child of God, to which Phil Carson responded with, "They may suck, but they're going to make a lot of money."
So they destroyed the audience there, and it was a breathtaking show. So I turned to Mark and I said, all right, I'll sign them. And he looked at me and he said, to Atlantic? I said, well, it's where I work. Yeah, I'm going to sign to Atlantic. He didn't say another word. He said, well, will you come back and meet the band? I said, absolutely not. Who wants to meet that lot? You know, I said I'd sign them. That's it. He said, they're never going to believe me. I said, oh, I've got a new band. I've just signed a band. I said, look, it's the first time I've signed an American band, but they happened to be over and they were really good. And Doug Morris said, what are they called? I said, Twisted Sister.
At which point Doug is like, are you fucking kidding me? They suck, they suck. I don't want them on my label, they suck. And Phil goes,
sure they suck, but, you know, they're going to sell a lot of records.
But we gotta try. So just remember, the kids are back. The kids are back. Oh, watch out. The kids are back.
This album is the sound of triumph. After a decade, they finally got a major label deal, but they weren't exactly comfortable yet because Atlantic still hated them and they had no real support. The only people at the label who liked them were Phil Carson and Jason Flom. In fact, due to the fact that they were slightly over budget on recording for this album, Atlantic wouldn't put it out unless the band paid the $4,000 they went over budget by. But the band didn't let it show on this album because we have songs like We're Gonna Make It, where they pretty much predicted their own success, and The Kids Are Back is maybe the definitive Twisted Sister song. It's a rallying cry if I've ever heard it. It was even used in Jackass, What More Do You Want? And they even scored a top 20 UK hits with I Am, I'm Me. It was the first of a few Twisted anthems, and we'll talk about some more later. It's maybe the cheesiest one they ever did, and the most wholesome one at the same time. It's about being yourself and following your dreams. I mean, I could see this being played in a Disney movie. I really love it.
I live as I please. I am and I'll be. I will, you'll see. I am and I'll be. I am, I'm me.
The sound once again isn't great. It's fine, sure, but it feels like it's lacking somewhat. It kinda sounds like they're recorded in a cave and the bass, guitars, and drums don't really sit well together in a mix. It sounds like they're playing live and the guitar amps are over here, the bass amps over there, the drums are over there. There's just too much of a separation. Also, is it just me or are there weird volume dips in between tracks? I think a good remix and remastering could do this album wonders. Now, it's not enough for me to not enjoy this album, revert to my prior rants about production on metal records, rarely making or breaking it, but I can tell it's so close to sounding perfect. All it needs is a little retooling, and I'm happy. Songs like Right to Live, Live to Ride are too catchy for their own good with a lot of power metal vibes, And Knife in the Back, Jesus Christ, talk about a groove. I love Mark Mendoza's very pronounced bass in the song. He's hitting the roots so consistently, and I like the little runs he does in between transitions. And in the song, D has tons of great lines. Just line this rack, are you starting to crack? I need this like a knife in the back. We have Suzanne's song, which is a nice sentiment. It's Dee's tribute to his wife, who, if you don't know, supported Dee and Twisted for many years. She designed their costumes, and was a big reason for them going from a glam look to whatever the fuck this is. And you gotta give her props for standing by her man long after many people would have justifiably walked. But I'm sorry, this song fucking sucks. It's meandering, goes nowhere, is super forgettable, and it comes across as limp as a biscuit. Dee, your heart was in the right place, but please, never try something like this again. But thankfully, the album ends with the first minor hit in the States, and a juggernaut of a song that never fails to hit the spot. The title track, You Can't Stop Rock and Roll. I'm somewhat burnt out on some of this band's other hits, but this song fills me up with the same giddy feeling today at 21 as it did when I was a booger-eating toddler. I remember watching this video on VHS with my dad and being scared but attracted to it at the same time. It's like when you have a fascination with your fears, whatever they may be. I had a similar feeling listening to and watching Twisted Sister as a child because they were so abrasive and frightening to a kid who had a hard time believing the Wicked Witch of the West wasn't real. It's a song that was made to be sung along to, at the top of your lungs. I know it's cheesy and pretty dated, but its charm remains all these years later, and you can't argue with that.
Your hands in praise. You can't stop rock and roll. You can't stop rock and roll. You can't stop rock and roll.
So, You Can't Stop Rock and Roll is another solid record. I still probably prefer Under the Blade. It's not really perfect, but we are getting there. The album did decently well in the UK, but in America it was a different story because Atlantic were being shit cunts. They didn't promote it, and they didn't really support the band at all. They had to tour in a fucking Winnebago with no money and travel across the country that way. But thanks to the band making a hell of a statement wherever they played live, and MTV using a snippet of You Can't Stop Rock and Roll for some of their advertisements, this album sold 100,000 copies, with basically no support from the label. The only thing they were getting from Atlantic was fucking contempt. And due to the modest success they had with basically no help at all, Doug Morris, the head of Atlantic, said to them what a mistake he had made, and that he was going to make it right and make them the biggest band in the world.
He had a whole bunch of ideas on how to clean up Twisted Sister. And I was arguing everything. You know, our fans. And finally Doug has had it. And he goes, how many fans do you think you have? So I did some math. You know, we had sold 150,000 albums, plus it was overseas. So, you know, whatever it was, I came up with a number, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000. And he said, what do you want? Those same 200,000 fans or the other 800,000 fans that'll give you a platinum album? And I caved. I said, I want to have a platinum record. He said, well, shut up. This is what you gotta do.
I'll fight for every inch I take. I'm desperate to the bone. Stay hungry, feel the fire. Stay hungry, don't explode. Stay hungry with desire. Stay hungry, you're alone.
When I think of classic records from the 80s, Stay Hungry is one of the first that come to mind. It's a masterpiece. It's up there with albums like 1984, Master of Puppets, and Purple Rain. At least for me. This album showcases the band at the height of their powers and hungrier than ever. The title is there for a reason, and the title track is an ode to never giving up and accomplishing whatever's in your sights. It may be slightly cornball, but it's a type of motivational that isn't insulting. And of course, we all know this album for its singles that are definitely on the lighter side, but this album also has some of the band's heaviest cuts they ever recorded. Burn in Hell is thrashy and almost speed metal, and there's also the Horror Terria epic. It includes two main parts, the first being Captain Howdy, a creepy and doomy song about a serial killer who targets children, and it's really creepy and disturbing. Dee pulls off the menacing and demented performance very well. And the second part is Street Justice, which is about said killer escaping, being punished for his crimes from a technicality, and the parents then execute street justice and ice that motherfucker. And I know this is very similar to Nightmare on Elm Street, but this album actually released 5 months before Nightmare, and the song just rips and is probably my favorite off this record.
You think you're going home to your own little bed, but that's impossible. You can't sleep when you're dead. Stay away from Captain Howdy. Stay away from Captain Howdy.
A point of contention with this album is the production. Many people say it's too clean and it sounds a little sanitized and it's lacking power. The main people I've seen say this is the band. They had a big problem with Tom Werman and how he approached producing this band, but honestly, I have no real complaints when it comes to the sound. Maybe the guitars could sound a little heavier with more gain, but that's all I have in terms of criticism. I'll take this a million times over before I take Still Hungry, I'll say that much. Bands should never re-record their classic material. It's never as good, it just always reeks of disappointment. But back to this album, one of my favorite cuts is The Price. It's a power ballad from before it became the big trend of the 80s for every metal band to release a ballad, and before it became so manufactured. I'm going to look back to the mid to late 80s metal records, and see how many have a lead single that's up-tempo, and a second single that's a ballad. There's too many to count. But The Price does not feel like an item being ticked off a checklist. It's about the sacrifices you have to make to achieve your goals. Keep in mind this was written before the band had actually made it, so you could see why the subject was on Dee's mind. And it's an overlooked thing for musicians. They have to be on the road for like 11 months out of the year, be away from their families just for the slight chance they can maybe make it in the music business. And it's something that applies to not just the music business, but so many things in life. You really gotta make some sacrifices for the things you want to accomplish. I'm sure you've noticed that I've kind of been dancing around the two big hits for this band, and that's not because I hate them or anything, quite the opposite in fact. But these songs contribute to Twisted Sister's status in the metal community and how many people just write them off as a joke or a gimmick band. It's an unfortunate thing where people may only have one or two experiences with a band, and if it's something that hasn't aged too well, like this band's videos, then it taints any idea of them being a serious band. And in the case of Twisted, it's not even the songs as it is the videos directed by Marty Kollner. These videos mainly focused on Mark Metcalf playing a similar character to Niedermeyer from Animal House, which he also played, just getting used and abused, and it's glorious. These videos caused a big moral outrage because it was the 80s. Why focused on important issues like the emerging AIDS crisis when we can get mad at a heavy metal band who dresses like women? And it culminated in Dee testifying before Congress, which is legendary. To this day, Dee sticking his finger to the PMRC in that Senate hearing is required viewing for those who love free speech. And these songs still rip to this day. I don't care how cheesy they are, they're still catchier than the plague. We're Not Gonna Take It has hook after hook with hard and driving drums from AG that are iconic. It's just a kick-ass hard rock song. Not really metal, but it's still a great song to sing at anybody trying to bring you down. And I Wanna Rock, my god. From the first line, it hits you like a cannon. It's songs like this that showed a Twisted Sister can write an anthem like nobody's fucking business. And even though it's more known by Zoomers for its inclusion in the first SpongeBob movie, the original still crushes.
So if you ask me why I like the way I play it, there's only one thing I can say to you. I wanna rock. I wanna rock. I want to rock.
So there we have it. After over 10 years and a lot of failure, Twisted Sister finally hit the big time, and for a brief moment of time, were one of, if not the biggest band in the entire world. The video has pushed them to heights they never before thought possible. They toured the country and decimated every place they played. They outclassed Congress and the PMRC, and Dee Snider made himself into an icon of heavy metal. Now, let's see how they fuck things up.
For me, that was the big challenge, to stay mad when I'd proven everything that I'd set out to prove. I remember clear as a bell sitting in $1 million house, poolside, 2 boats, 5 cars, and I'm in the sun trying to write the next angry teen song. And I can't think of a friggin' word, because I couldn't be happier.
Just follow me and you'll set yourself free. Now won't you come out and play? Come out and play. Come on out and play. Come out and play.
God, reviewing Come Out and Play is like reviewing the fall of the Roman Empire. Ever heard the tragedy of Dee Snider, the cross-dresser? The demise of Twisted Sister can't really be blamed on one event. There were several things at once. It was the PMRC creating a moral panic about them, their fans finding out that Dee was a straight-edge family man, the fact that the band was falling apart, Dee having problems writing the next album due to the fact he was no longer hungry and desperate. One of the videos for this album got banned from MTV, but probably the biggest issue was overexposure. They played the videos from Stay Hungry Around the Clock, as well as the 1984 live show, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a Karen complaining about hard rock or heavy metal in the 80s without mentioning Twisted Sister. They went from the coolest thing in the world to the lamest band this side of the Mississippi in only a few short months. And the singles did not help at all. They also had ridiculous videos, but they seemed less self-aware, and the songs themselves, oof. But there's also other songs of this album that would have made great singles. They may not have been quite as commercial as other songs, but they wouldn't have destroyed the band's reputation either. For example, I Believe in Rock and Roll. It may be the cheesiest song I've ever heard in my life, but out of everything off this record, I think this would have had the best chance. It's rocking, has hook after hook, and isn't too far removed from I Wanna Rock. I mean, just listening to this, I can see a kick-ass video for it in my head, and it probably would have caught on.
Every day I lose control. Every day I rock and roll. Every day it's gonna have to see me through. I believe in rock and roll. I believe in rock and roll. I believe in rock and roll.
The main thing that's pointed to as a killer of this album is Leader of the Pack. And that's justified because this is a heinous piece of 80s dick cheese that is only compounded by the equally lame video. What the fuck am I looking at here? They switched the pronouns as it's supposed to be from the guy's perspective, not the girl's perspective from the original Shangri-La's classic, but it only makes the twisted version make no sense as a story. It comes across as a kid's bopified version of the original song, everything from the dopey background vocals to Dee's hammy performance. Guys, just because this worked in the clubs doesn't mean it should be a single. There's also Be Cruel to Your School featuring Alice Cooper, which just comes across as desperate. It's also got Billy Joel and Brian Setzer on the song as well. Just because you have all these special guests, it doesn't make this shitty song any better. The video for it was banned from MTV for being offensive. I'm not saying it should have been banned, but they did get Tom Savini, who did the makeup for Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead for this video, so maybe you shouldn't be too surprised when it gets banned. I recently heard an interview with JJ, and he said that they should have released The Fire Still Burns as the single. And I can't really disagree. I'm not gonna lie, it's probably my favorite song this band ever did. It's pretty much power metal. It has an amazing solo and a great chorus. Same thing goes for Kill or Be Killed. People think Twisted Sister went soft after Stay Hungry, which is true to an extent, but songs like this prove that this band's heavy side was far from dead and extinguished.
Choose your weapons. This war started long before you came. Fight the good fight. Let's be sure they'll never rise again. It's kill or be killed. Live or let die. Kill or be killed. Though you don't know why.
Also, this album sounds great. It was produced by Dieter Dierks, who produced pretty much all of the Scorpions classic records. It's arguably the best sound they ever had on an album. And it's a real shame that most of this album rarely takes advantage of the great kick-ass sound, as there's a lot of ballads that are just boring and sappy, like King of the Fools and Out on the Street. And there's songs that try to be hard rockers like Looking Out for Number One or You Want What We Got, which is just lackluster compared to songs like I Wanna Rock. Overall, even though there's songs with this album that I would put up there with some of the band's best, like the title track or The Fire Still Burns, there's too much filler and drivel to recommend this album to just about anyone.
Love is for Suckers was supposed to be my solo album initially. The music on there was supposed to be for a solo record.
And I was tired. I was really tired. I mean, for me, being the only original member, it had been 15 years, and something like, for me, 9,000 shows. If you look at the early days of 4 or 5 shows a night, 6 nights a week, 9,000 shows roughly. I was tired, and I just wanted a break.
The record company and management encouraged me to use this music as the next Twisted Sister record. And I think that they just forced an already bad situation and made matters worse. So the clock was ticking for the end of the band.
You're so beautiful, so unforgettable. To me, they just don't mean anything. Love is for dreamers. Love is for believers. Love is for losers. Love is for suckers.
If Come Out and Play was the Titanic hitting the iceberg, then Love is for Suckers is the ship at the bottom of the fucking sea. Not that Love is for Suckers is necessarily terrible, there's some good stuff to be found, but damn, this record reeks of desperation. And not in a cool way like in this band's infancy, but on this album, it's just really sad. It's a sound of a band self-destructing. Originally, this was supposed to be a D. Snider solo album, and it would have been a good opportunity for the band to have a break from each other and for D to get an album out of his system that isn't quite Twisted Sister. But Atlantic, in their infinite wisdom, decided to force 5 guys who hated each other into a recording studio for a few months and record material that only 1 out of 5 even liked. And it wasn't even 5 since A.J. Pero decided to leave after the Come Out and Play tour turned into a fiasco, and he was then replaced by Joey Franco, and he was fine, but he wasn't A.J. Pero. You can really feel his absence on this album. This album bombs really badly. It didn't even go gold like Come Out and Play. It only charted at number 74 in the US charts, and the closest thing this band had to a hit on this album was the lead single Hot Love, which I do like, even though it's very of its time. I can see a band like Warrants doing the song, but it's a catchy enough tune with a pretty good hook, so I can't get too mad at it.
Should I pass? Should I play? Put my feet turn to clay. 'Cause she's blowing me away. Talking about hot love. You're making me crazy. Hot love. You're making me bad. Hot love.
And most of the songs of this album are in a similar vein to Hot Love. It's very hair metal, but it does have its moments of heaviness and sounding like traditional Twisted Sister. Dee did write these songs after all, but even with the heavier tracks, something just feels off, and it's probably because the band were very divided during the recording. Eddie and JJ apparently barely played on it, Reb Beach from Winger did most of the guitar work on this album, and Mark Mendoza had a lot of problems with Beau Hill, who produced this record. He said he recorded his bass tracks in about the same amount of time it takes you to listen to this record. He wasn't exactly happy. But when the album hits, it hits pretty hard. The title track, Yeah Right, and Tonight are good melodic metal songs, even though it's not quite what I want from Twisted, as well as the opening track, Wake Up the Sleeping Giants. It's such a defiant middle finger to their oppressors, and it's the only song off this album this band has ever performed after this album's tour. And also, if this was released as a single, it might not have helped the band sell any more copies, but damn, it would have made one hell of a statement.
What we can do and how we can play. We got the numbers, we got the might, we got the strength and we got the right, we got the reason, we got the night to wake up the sleeping giant.
But Love is for Suckers is dragged down by too much dreck like I'm So Hot for You and One Bad Habit to make it really worthwhile. Most of this record is a real bore, and it's sad to see such a great band go out on an album like this. The tour for this album barely lasted over a month before Dee quit the band. They had taken off their makeup and were scrubbed of all the features that made this band so unique in the first place. Dee said himself that at this point they were a shell of their former selves, and that's a real shame. After the band broke up, Mark Mendoza joined Blackfoot, JJ worked with the band Seven Dust, and Dee formed some other bands like Desperado with Iron Maiden's Clive Burr, and Widowmaker. But that was about it, and the guys eventually got normal jobs, and Dee got into radio and worked in other mediums. In 1998, Dee wrote the movie Strangeland based on the horror Terrier songs from Stay Hungry, and my god, it's such a fun B-movie. It's so bad, it's good, then it goes back to being bad again. Honestly, I can make a whole separate video about this flick. There's a lot I have to say about it.
What a rush!
And Dee reunited Twisted Sister for the soundtrack of Strangeland, with a song called Heroes Are Hard to Find. And I'll be honest, I think it sucks. It's too lightweight and has nothing I want from Twisted Sister. Also, it's really out of place in that soundtrack. And there's also a Twisted Sister tribute record that featured bands like Overkill, Motorhead, and Joan Jett covering Twisted Sister songs, and the band themselves were present with a cover of one of my favorite AC/DC tracks, Sin City, which was okay. But unfortunately, we all know that the thing to get the band back together for real was unfortunately a really great tragedy. They played a full live show for the first time in 14 years for a benefit for a Widows and Orphans Fund for their first responders on 9/11. And since the band were from New Jersey and played in the New York area a lot, you can see why they jumped at the opportunity to play at such an event. And the performance was really well received, and it led to them playing more shows, though they never really toured again. They only consistently played shows in Europe, where the band is a much bigger draw than in the States, and they also never recorded a new album either. But they did do some things in the studio, like the lame Still Hungry re-recording, and an even lamer Christmas album, Guys I Love Ya, But Why? And they did record one new song called 30 for some special edition of Stay Hungry, and I really dug it. It was no Fire Still Burns, but it was great to hear a new Twisted Sister all these years later.
We can still bring the house down like we did way back when. Oh, we can cuss, we can fight, we can go all night, still tear it up even though 30 came and went a long, long time ago.
Though in 2015, AJ Pero sadly passed away of a heart attack while on tour with the band Adrenaline Mob. The band later announced a final tour titled 40 and Fuck It, since it was about 40 years since they had formed, and they didn't want to continue without such a vital member, since they still had their entire classic lineup until that point. They recruited none other than Mike Portnoy to take AJ's place for the tour, which is a little bizarre, but AJ replaced him in Adrenaline Mob, so it kinda came full circle. And Mike played admirably. Of course he didn't fit in with the band as well as AJ, but that was a given, and I won't hold that against him. And then in November of 2016, the band played their final show in Mexico, and they have yet to come back, unlike some other bands after a final tour. Motley Crue. And that was the story of the one and only Twisted Sister. Whether you loved them or hated them, they're one of the most unique bands in all of hard rock and heavy metal. They did everything short of killing themselves on stage to bring their fans the best show they ever saw. And they left behind a short, sweet, if slightly inconsistent collection of records that will be here long after we're all dead and buried. So, this one's for you guys in the band, and all the sick motherfuckers watching this video. God bless, and until next time, take it easy, party people.
Somebody threw a shit on the stage.
As hate-filled as I am, could I actually pick up a human shit and throw it? And then, where do you get it? Does someone make it? Is it yours? Do you save it for later?
Do you buy it? Is there a shite stand, you know? Or...
I'm just trying to picture how this got to the point where it's actually on the stage. But yeah, someone threw a human shit at the band. You really gotta hate a band to do that.
Subscribe to Scooped Mids.